The Longbottom House had never learned how to grieve quietly. Grief stood in silver frames on mantels and watched from gilt canvases in the corridors. Grief lived in the locked west wing where dust thickened over old furniture, and no one with a beating heart went unless necessity drove them. Grief sat at the breakfast table in the chair that had been Frank's, and in the hush that followed whenever Alice's name was spoken aloud. Even the clock seemed to tick with a kind of caution, as if time itself had been warned not to make too much noise in a place where loss had settled in so completely that it had come to resemble lineage. Neville Longbottom knew the house by its silences before he knew it by its rooms. He knew the silence after one of his grandmother's guests said with careful brightness, "There is certainly a family look about him," and the silence after his grandmother replied, "Yes," without adding anything more. He knew the silence that followed family stories told in front of him as though he were too young to understand them, though he understood perfectly well what it meant when adults lowered their voices and said brave, brilliant, gifted, then looked across the room at him as if the contrast had become a thing with a shape and weight of its own. He was 10 years old that autumn, and already he had the uncomfortable sense that he was being measured against people who existed more clearly in photographs than he did in life. On that particular afternoon, he was sitting very straight in a deep chair upholstered in green damask, trying not to spill tea into the saucer, and trying even harder not to notice Great Aunt Enid's expression every time he fumbled with the handle. Firelight polished the dark wood panels of the drawing room. Outside the long windows, the rose garden lay under a crust of white frost, its last black-red blooms bowed like exhausted heads. "He's a quiet one," Great Aunt Enid said, as though Neville were a dog in need of better breeding. "He's thoughtful," Augusta replied. It was not praise. It was a correction, crisp as the crease in her gloves. Neville bent over his cup. His fingers were damp. He wished he were outside, where the cold would sting his face and no one would ask him to say a spell or hold a wand or perform any small proof that he was, after all, a wizard and not some grave clerical mistake God had made in the nursery. Great Uncle Algy, who had once bounced him out of infancy and into family legend, snorted into his drink. Thoughtful. Ha! Frank was thoughtful. Alice was thoughtful. This one's just nervous. Augusta set down her cup with a click. "Algy. Oh, don't look like that, sister. He knows we mean well." Neville did know they meant well. That, in some ways, was the trouble. Cruelty would have been easier. Cruelty could be disliked cleanly. Affection mixed with disappointment was a far muddier thing. It clung. He had heard the story of his own inadequacy so many times that it seemed less memory than family scripture. How everyone had worried because there was so little sign of magic in him. How Great Uncle Algy had tried to frighten some out with dropped puddings, near drownings, and one spectacular accident involving an upstairs window and a moment of inattention, while Great Aunt Enid, how Neville had fallen, bounced down the garden, and at last proved himself by surviving in a manner sufficiently magical to reassure the bloodline. It ought to have been a triumphant story. In practice, it made him feel like a plant that had taken far too long to come up. Tea ended as teas did at Longbottom House, with the scraping back of chairs, the adjusting of gloves, the polite exchange of old names and older grievances. Augusta escorted her guests to the front hall with the rigid courtesy that for her passed as warmth. Neville slipped away through the side passage before anyone could stop him and let himself out into the garden. Cold met him all at once, clean and honest. He breathed it in, as if it were medicine. The walled garden lay beyond the formal lawn, half kitchen plot and half old-fashioned pleasure ground, enclosed by brick mellowed almost black by age. Ivy roped the walls. Bare pear branches scratched at the pale sky. A small glass frame stood empty near the beds where summer herbs had long since been cut back, though rosemary and sage still held their shape. Neville shoved his hands into the pockets of his cardigan and went along the path between the rose bushes, careful not to brush the thorns. This was the only place on the estate where he did not feel perpetually as though he had entered a room mid-conversation and discovered that everyone had been discussing him. Plants had their own tempers, but their tempers were simple. A rose wanted light. Mint wanted room and would cheerfully steal it. Honeysuckle wanted to climb. If leaves yellowed, there was almost always a reason. If roots rotted, one could find the source. Human beings were not so obliging. Human beings could love you fiercely and still make you feel small enough to vanish between floorboards. A cluster of late hellebore buds drooped beneath the window of the old morning room. Neville crouched beside them and touched one gently, no more than the back of a knuckle against the waxy green shell. He did not know why he did it. He only knew the plant looked tired. The bud lifted a fraction. Neville froze. A breeze moved through the garden wall at that exact moment, whispering the ivy leaves. That must be it, he told himself at once. A draft. The world full of ordinary explanations hastily offered up to boys who needed them. Still, he stayed crouched there a moment longer, staring at the hellebore as if it might do something again. Cold hands will not improve your concentration. He looked up. Augusta stood in the archway with her cloak clasped at the throat, the emerald plume on her hat dark against the lowering sky. She had a way of appearing in silence that made people straighten before they even knew why. "Sorry, Gran. I did not ask for an apology." Her gaze shifted briefly to the plant. "We are leaving in 10 minutes. St. Mungo's." A small fist seemed to close around something deep inside his chest. "Yes, Gran." She nodded once and turned back toward the house. Neville rose, brushing damp earth from his knees. He looked at the hellebore again before following. The bud had not moved. At St. Mungo's, the smell was always the same. Potion fumes beneath linen soap, sweetness over sickness, hope bottled and stoppered. The permanent spell damage ward was too bright by design. Someone had once decided that pale green walls and polished windows would make pain look more manageable. It never had. Neville walked beside his grandmother past beds enclosed by screens, past witches muttering to invisible listeners, past an elderly wizard trying to fold a newspaper that kept turning into gulls. The healer on duty inclined her head to Augusta with the respectful caution people always used around old names and old tragedies. Then they went into the room that held what was left of his parents. Frank sat in a chair by the window, staring at rain beginning to stipple the glass. He was still a handsome man in the bones of his face. That fact struck Neville every time with a private kind of violence. Alice sat on the bed plucking, with great seriousness, at the fringe of a woolen blanket. Her hair had been brushed back that morning. Neville knew because Augusta noticed such things and thanked the healers when they had done them well. "Mother," Augusta said, her voice becoming formal in a different way, the way it did in churches and courtrooms and hospital rooms. "Neville is here." Alice turned. Her face lit, not with recognition exactly, but with the soft instinctive brightness she always had for him, as if some part of her that no curse had managed to extinguish still knew kindness on sight. Neville went to her at once. "Hello, Mum." She made a little sound in her throat and touched his sleeve. Her fingers were light, bird-bone delicate. Then, with solemn concentration, she began patting the pockets of her dressing gown. Neville waited. Augusta looked away toward the rain. At last, Alice produced an empty sweet wrapper, carefully folded. She pressed it into Neville's palm with all the ceremony of a queen bestowing honors. "Thank you," Neville said, because one never said anything else. "Thank you, Mum." He put it at once into his pocket. Across the room, Frank turned his head a fraction. His eyes passed over them without landing. A pot of white starflowers sat on the sill beside his chair. One of the stalks had bent badly. The blooms were going brown at the edges. Neville found himself looking at it for far too long. While Augusta spoke in low tones to the healer near the door, he stepped toward the window, drawn by the poor drooping thing for reasons he could not have explained. He touched the cracked rim of the pot. Warmth ran unexpectedly through his hand, as distinct as if he had laid it against sunlit stone. The bent stalk quivered. Neville snatched his fingers back. The starflowers trembled once and slowly, impossibly. The broken head lifted. Not far, barely at all, but enough that the nearest bloom turned toward the light. His heartbeat stumbled. "Neville?" He whipped around. Augusta was watching him from across the room, one gloved hand still on the back of Alice's chair. There was a question in her face, and beneath it, something that vanished almost before he could name it. Sorry, he muttered. I thought it was falling over. She looked from him to the plant and back again. We must go. Nothing more was said. Yet all the way home through the wet evening, while the carriage wheels hissed on the road, and the house rose black against the slate sky, Neville could not stop thinking about the bud in the garden and the flower on the windowsill and the peculiar unsettling certainty that something in the world had answered when he touched it. That night, lying in bed under curtains too heavy for a child's liking, he listened to the wind move through the trees and through the cracked panes of the west greenhouse. Somewhere in the old part of the house, a latch clicked of its own accord. Neville pulled the blankets to his chin and told himself it was only the settling of age. Even so, long after midnight, he lay awake with the uncomfortable conviction that the house, in all its paneled silence, had heard something wake. The Hogwarts letter arrived on a hot morning in July when the lavender by the south wall was in a blue haze, and even the portraits seemed too languid to argue among themselves. A tawny owl struck the breakfast room window with enough force to rattle the glass, then indignantly hammered until the maid let it in. It stamped through the marmalade dish, shed 2 feathers on the tablecloth, and thrust out a square envelope of thick yellowish parchment addressed in emerald green ink to Mr. Neville Longbottom. Front bedroom, Longbottom House, Upper Flagley. Neville knew what it must be before Augusta reached for it. He knew because for the past fortnight every hinge creak, every wing beat overhead, every post owl glimpsed over the lane had tightened him with expectation. Even so, when she slit the letter open with the breakfast knife and read the first line, his ears filled with a rushing sound. "Well," she said. It was the nearest thing to astonishment Neville had ever heard in her voice. "Well?" She lowered the parchment and looked at him directly, not past him, or through him, or at the memory of some other face overlaid upon his own, but at him. Her eyes were very bright. "You have been accepted to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." Something vast and terrified and shining opened inside him. He half rose from his chair and sat down again because he did not know what one did when the future arrived at the breakfast table. "Oh," he said. Augusta gave a single short laugh, almost disbelieving. Oh, indeed. If she had embraced him, Neville might have cried from sheer shock. Augusta did not embrace. Instead, she read the letter through twice more, summoned a quill, and began making a list of required purchases in the fast, decisive hand with which she attacked both practical arrangements and emotional upheaval. By luncheon, 3 neighbors knew. By supper, 6 relatives. By the following morning, Great-Uncle Algy's owl came with a package large enough to require 2 servants and a great deal of swearing. Inside was Trevor, old, squat, slightly balding, and blinking with mournful distrust from a wicker traveling basket lined with tartan flannel. A note tied to the handle read, "In honor of the family not being wholly disgraced. Look after him better than you look after your hat. Algy." "He's lovely," Neville said, because Trevor, with his resigned expression and warty feet, looked exactly like the sort of creature one might confide in without fear of correction. "He is a toad," Augusta said. "But yes, he will do." Nah. The weeks that followed passed in a whirl of lists, fittings, cauldron catalogues, and that strange, dizzy feeling of standing on the threshold of a life one had imagined so long it had lost all resemblance to reality. Neville went with Augusta to Diagon Alley for books and robes and brass scales. At the apothecary he lingered over packets of powdered roots and tied bundles of dried herbs, while Augusta negotiated over prices with the cold exactitude of a field commander. At Flourish and Blots he breathed in the dusty smell of hundreds of books, and felt for the first time a flutter of something that might have been excitement unmixed with dread. There was, however, one purchase they did not make. On the evening before his departure, Augusta called him into the morning room where the shutters had already been drawn against a sky thick with rain. On the table before her lay a long wand box of dark walnut, the lid already open. "This was your father's," she said. Neville stopped 3 steps inside the room. The wand looked older than he had expected, not merely used but inhabited, as if the years had soaked into the grain. He had seen it once before at a distance, locked in a glass-fronted cabinet in Frank's study with his Order of Merlin and an old photograph from training days. Now it lay across black velvet, like a relic from a church whose saints no longer answered prayer. Gran, I thought. A new wand is not a necessity when a perfectly good one already exists in the family. Her tone made economy sound like doctrine. Yet she was not looking at him. She was looking at the wand. "It is an honor, Neville." He swallowed. "Yes, Gran." He reached out. The wood was warm from the room, or from her hands, or from some memory it carried. The moment his fingers closed around it, he felt not belonging, exactly, but awareness, as if he had picked up an object that knew perfectly well he was not the man it had been made for. Augusta noticed his hesitation. "You will grow into it," she said. Then, after a pause strange enough to gather the room into stillness, she opened the drawer beside her chair and withdrew a second object. It was a small casket no longer than her hand, carved from pale wood darkened in the grooves by age. Silver wire had been laid into its lid in a pattern like thorned stems circling a single seed. There was no visible keyhole. The crest worked into the clasp was old-fashioned and unfamiliar, not the modern Longbottom arms of badger, wand, and laurel, but a twisting root around a tower. "This turned up in a cabinet in the West Wing," Augusta said. "It belonged, I believe, to your great-grandmother Araminta's mother, though no one ever made much sense of it. The thing never opens. Probably nonsense. Family houses gather nonsense the way pawns gather duckweed." Neville took the casket. It was unexpectedly heavy. "Why are you giving it to me?" Her mouth tightened, though not unkindly. "Because you are leaving this house as a child of it. Because some things ought not remain forgotten merely because they are inconvenient. And because—" She glanced at the window, where rain traced uncertain silver down the glass. "I have lately had the unpleasant feeling that this one has been waiting." He looked down at the carved lid. The silver lines caught the lamplight. For a second he thought he smelled damp earth, fresh turned. "Keep it out of the way in your trunk," Augusta said briskly, as if regretting her moment of oddness. "Do not let anyone steal it. Do not show it off. And for heaven's sake, do not lose it." He nodded at once. "I won't." The next morning at King's Cross, the station roof trapped the steam from the engines until the light itself seemed red and breathing. Muggle travelers hurried past in summer coats, unaware of the hidden platform beyond the barrier, while witches in sensible hats and wizards with trunks charmed to follow at heel stood in knots of parting and advice. Somewhere overhead, pigeons flapped among the girders. Neville clutched Trevor's basket in one hand and the handle of his trunk in the other. Frank's wand was in his inside pocket. The little casket rested beneath a folded pair of socks at the very top of his luggage, but he could feel its presence all the same, a small secret weight following him toward the train. Augusta adjusted the fastening of his robe collar with fingers that were gentler than her expression. "Write regularly. Remember that no family name was ever improved by slovenliness. Mind your books. Mind your wand. If you are uncertain, ask a professor before you do anything idiotic." "Yes, Gran." "And Neville," she hesitated, which for her was almost an act of naked emotion. "Do not decide too early what sort of boy you are." He blinked at her. "I don't understand." "No? Well?" She drew herself up. "Perhaps that is just as well. Off you go." Then she did something she had not done since he was very little. She touched 2 fingers, briefly, to his cheek. It startled him more than the train whistle. By the time he had made it through the barrier and onto platform 9 3/4, his stomach had filled with a kind of liquid panic. The scarlet train waited under the iron roof like a promise so large it had become almost threatening. Students leaned from windows calling farewells. Cats wound between trunks. An owl shrieked from somewhere overhead. Neville found an empty compartment halfway down, shoved his trunk inside with difficulty, wedged Trevor's basket on the seat and sat for exactly half a minute before realizing the basket lid had not been latched properly. Trevor was gone. The next 20 minutes dissolved into horror. He checked beneath seats, under cloaks, in luggage racks, in compartments full of older boys who told him to get lost, and compartments full of younger children who looked at him with that horrid expression of alarmed pity, reserved for people obviously already failing at school before they had even left the station. He tried the corridor 3 times. He got in the way of a trolley witch and apologized so fervently, she gave him a sugar quill for free out of sheer self-defense. He looked in the lavatory. No Trevor. By the time the train gave its first lurch, Neville was hot, breathless, and close to tears. He had almost decided to sit on the floor and die of disgrace when he found himself stopping at the open door of a compartment where a skinny, black-haired boy with round glasses sat opposite a lanky, red-headed one. They both looked up. "Have either of you seen a toad?" Neville blurted. "He's called Trevor and he's not very clever and I think he may have got out, and if I lose him on the first day my gran will." The black-haired boy's expression turned instantly sympathetic. "We haven't, sorry." The red-headed boy leaned sideways to peer into the corridor. "We'll help you look." Neville opened his mouth to protest and found he could not. Relief had risen too fast for speech. Before any of them could move, another figure appeared behind him. A girl with a great deal of bushy brown hair and front teeth that gave her an air of permanent determination. "Someone lost a toad," she said briskly. Honestly, if we're going to have to search properly, we should begin at the front of the train and work back." Neville stared at her. "Well," she said, "it won't find itself." And so, absurdly, he found himself walking the corridor between strangers who seemed to have accepted his catastrophe as a shared project, with the train gathering speed beneath them and the platform vanishing into the London haze behind. He did not know then that one of those strangers was the most famous boy in the wizarding world, nor that the girl's bossiness concealed a loyal heart, nor that the red-haired boy's easy laughter would become a comfort to many people less lonely than he was. In that moment he only knew that, for the first time in his life, his panic had not been met with criticism. It had simply been answered. They did not find Trevor in the next 5 compartments, nor the next 10. They found instead all the peculiar life of a train carrying a new year of magic northward. A set of twins charming licorice wands to fence with one another. A pale little girl in green ribbons who had packed 3 teapots and no socks. A boy trying to turn his own eyebrows blue by reading from a booklet titled Simple Hexes for the Home. Hermione, who introduced herself as Hermione Granger before anyone else had managed so much as a surname, tested every clue as if it were an exam question, and took personal offense when several proved to be ordinary frogs. Ron Weasley apologized whenever his laughter escaped him, which was often and never maliciously. The black-haired boy hung back a little at first, observing more than he spoke. It was only when a 4th-year girl from Ravenclaw stopped dead in the corridor, stared and gasped, "You are Harry Potter," that Neville understood whom he had been blundering through the train with. Harry looked miserable enough under the recognition that Neville felt at once protective of him, though the feeling seemed too presumptuous to admit aloud. "I'm sorry," Neville said later, when they had collapsed for a minute into the compartment and Hermione had gone off to inspect the next carriage. "I should have known." Harry shrugged, looking out the window where late summer fields streamed by in blurred gold and green. "I don't mind you not knowing." Ron snorted. "He rather likes it." Harry smiled despite himself, and the compartment seemed at once easier. They shared sweets because Ron's mother had packed too much, and Harry seemed incapable of believing that food on the trolley could simply be bought and enjoyed rather than cherished as a rare privilege. Neville contributed 2 treacle fudge bars Augusta had included with stern disclaimers about cavities. Trevor remained missing. Hermione returned from each unsuccessful sweep looking more energized than discouraged. Draco Malfoy appeared in the doorway while Ron was teaching Harry the correct method of eating a chocolate frog without losing the card. He had the air of someone entering a room he fully expected to improve by his presence alone. Two broad boys stood behind him like poorly disguised bodyguards. "So it's true then," Draco said, fixing Harry with cool gray eyes. "Harry Potter." The compartment changed temperature. Even Neville, who had barely exchanged a word with the boy, felt it. Harry looked up, wary. "Yes." Draco inclined his head as if this confirmed some private prophecy. "I'm Draco Malfoy." Ron made a faint choking sound that might have been a laugh or a swallowed insult. Draco's gaze flicked over Ron's patched robes, Neville's anxious face, the scattered sweets, and returned at last to Harry. "You'll soon find some wizarding families are better than others, Potter. You don't want to go making friends with the wrong sort." It was said lightly, almost lazily, but the words had sharp edges underneath. Neville felt them because he had grown up among their kind. Not the exact phrasing, perhaps, but the assumption behind it. That old names and clean vaults and proper marriages conferred a quality separate from decency, intelligence, courage, or kindness. He had heard it at dinners, in drawing rooms, in the pause before people remembered that his mother had fought beside Muggleborns and half-bloods, without caring a damn what was written in their family trees. Harry looked at Draco's offered hand and then at Ron. "I think I can tell the wrong sort for myself," he said. Draco's face did not change much. That, somehow, made the faint flush along his cheekbones more noticeable. "Suit yourself." He turned and went, the two boys behind him shuffling after. Ron let out the breath he had been holding. "Brilliant," he said. Neville laughed, a startled sound that seemed to come from somewhere far less timid than his usual self. By the time the train pulled into Hogsmeade Station under a sky full of gathering twilight, Trevor was still missing. Hermione's hair had increased in size by a quarter due to the weather, and Neville's stomach had knotted itself so thoroughly that he was no longer certain he had one. The first sight of Hogwarts unstitched him. Castle was too small a word for that mass of towers and turrets rising black against the indigo sky above the lake. Every window lit as if stars had descended and lodged themselves in stone. The boats bobbed at the water's edge, lantern light breaking in long gold ribbons over the dark. Voices hushed of their own accord. Even the older students who had clearly seen it before spoke lower. Neville climbed into a boat with Hermione, Harry, and Ron and could barely keep his hands from shaking. The lake smelled of wet stone and reeds. Above them the castle loomed and altered with every ripple, not fixed but alive, like something slumbering lightly. Inside, beneath the enchanted ceiling of the great hall and the thousands of candles floating in air, he felt at once more afraid and more possible than he had ever done in his life. The Sorting Hat was worse than he had imagined. When Professor McGonagall placed it over his ears, the world vanished into smell, dust, old felt, faint traces of hundreds of foreheads, and then a dry little voice spoke right into his thoughts. "Ah," it said, "another Longbottom." Neville nearly leapt off the stool. "Nervous, aren't we?" Understandable. A great deal of noise in that name. A great deal of pressure. Loyalty. Kindness. A love of growing things. Quite a stubborn core hidden down where even you've not looked closely. Curious. Very curious. Please, Neville thought desperately, because the hall seemed to be waiting with cruel, bright faces tilted upward. "Please, not Gryffindor." "Not Gryffindor?" the Hat said, sounding amused. "My dear boy, you are talking as if courage were comfort. It is nothing of the kind." "Hufflepuff," Neville pleaded. You would rather not be measured," the Hat said gently now. "I understand that. But that is not the same as not being brave." He could hear the blood rushing in his ears. The pause lengthened. Somewhere far away a bench creaked. The Hat laughed softly. "Gryffindor." Applause crashed up around him. Neville stumbled off the stool in a blur of red and gold and sat down at the Gryffindor table because that seemed to be where his legs had taken him. Someone thumped him on the back. One of the Weasley twins whooped. Hermione was sorted to Gryffindor and looked triumphantly vindicated. Harry came moments later to a roar that made the candles shiver. Ron followed, pink with relief. Neville smiled because everyone else was smiling, because to do otherwise would be ungracious, because there was nowhere now to hide from the house that prized daring above all virtues and had just claimed him with a certainty he did not remotely feel. That first night in the tower dormitory, while the other boys fumbled into pajamas and Dean Thomas talked excitedly about moving staircases, and Seamus Finnegan admitted he had tried to set his hat on fire to test whether the castle was real, Neville unpacked quietly. Frank's wand went into the bedside drawer. Trevor's empty basket sat accusingly by the trunk. At the very top, beneath folded shirts, he found the small carved casket exactly where he had packed it. He held it a moment in the dim light from the common room fire filtering under the door. The silver inlay traced cold beneath his thumb. Then, just as he was about to put it away, he felt the faintest knock from within, like a seed tapping against wood. Neville jerked and nearly dropped it. "What's that?" Seamus asked from across the room. "Nothing," Neville said too quickly. He shoved the casket beneath his socks, shut the trunk, and climbed into bed with his pulse beating hard against the pillow. Outside the tower window, the wind moved around the turrets and sent 100 leaves whispering across the dark grounds below. Far off, beyond the lawns and the glass roofs of the greenhouses, something in the night seemed to answer. The first weeks of term arranged themselves rapidly into a pattern that would have crushed Neville if he had not discovered, almost by accident, that one corner of Hogwarts did not seem inclined to punish him for being himself. Most of the castle did. Potions was a succession of humiliations conducted under torchlight, and a ceiling low enough to press the fumes back down among the students. Professor Snape glided between the desks like an especially disapproving bat, making Neville feel clumsier simply by existing in the vicinity. Charms required confidence he did not possess and delicate wandwork his borrowed wand refused to grant. In Transfiguration, Professor McGonagall's severe intelligence made him long to apologize for every inadequacy he had ever exhibited since birth. Even History of Magic, which demanded almost nothing but endurance, managed to make him feel at fault when he lost his place in notes and had to borrow Hermione's. He wrote dutiful letters home that sounded like reports composed under mild duress. "Classes are going well, Gran. The castle is very impressive. I have not yet lost anything important except Trevor, who has now been found twice. Professor McGonagall says I must work on my concentration. Please tell Mrs. Tibbs the gray owl she lent me bites." He did not mention that Frank's wand felt wrong in his hand, not wicked or broken but stubbornly aloof, as though every spell had first to pass through the memory of another wizard before it could emerge. It was like wearing someone else's handwriting. Some mornings he thought he could feel the wand resisting him in tiny, invisible ways, turning a fraction slow, finishing the flourish with impatience rather than grace. Then there was herbology. The greenhouses crouched beyond the castle proper, damp and warm and full of life so profuse it bordered on unruliness. Their glass walls purled with condensation. The air smelled of wet earth, sap, old leaves, and the pleasant rot from which new things rose. In the first greenhouse, Professor Pomona Sprout introduced herself with the practical warmth of someone who cared for students much as she cared for plants, attentively, unsentimentally, and with a clear understanding that neglect could kill. "Now then," she said, hands on hips, hat askew and spectacles fogging from the heat. "If any of you have the bright idea to put your fingers in something with teeth, you may keep the results and show them to Madame Pomfrey yourselves. Hufflepuffs, stop looking pleased with yourselves. You are not immune to foolishness. Gryffindors, less swagger, more listening." "Menda." The Hufflepuffs grinned. Neville, standing between Harry and a flaxen-haired Hufflepuff girl introduced as Hannah Abbott, felt something unclench in him simply because no one here looked polished. Soil-stained cuffs equally. Even the prettiest children sweated in the greenhouse heat. Their task that day involved repotting a tray of snarling tuber seedlings, whose roots disliked disturbance and whose leaves snapped sharply at careless hands. Hermione approached hers as if it were a difficult essay to be mastered through logic. Ron muttered that any plant with an attitude ought to be composted on principle. Neville stared at his tray, and before he quite knew he was doing it, laid his hand lightly against the rim of the pot. The nearest seedling stilled. Not altogether. Its leaves still twitched with irritability, but the vicious little biting movement calmed into something almost cautious. Neville bent closer. The plant's thin stem had gone pale near the base. It wanted more depth, he thought suddenly. More room below, less water above. The certainty arrived complete and inexplicable. "Try a deeper pot," he murmured. "Hmm?" Hannah said beside him. Neville flushed. "Nothing." He repotted the seedling accordingly. It took the soil without protest. Across the table, Susan Bones let out a yelp as hers fastened on her glove. Professor Sprout disentangled it with practiced fingers and turned in time to see Neville setting the last of his own into place. Every one of them unexpectedly docile. "Well now," she said. Neville looked up, alarmed. "Have you worked with root biters before?" "No, Professor." "Family garden?" "Only ordinary things mostly. Gran grows roses." "No day." Sprout's gaze moved over his finished tray. "These are not ordinary things." Hannah leaned around him. "Mine keeps trying to murder me." "It can probably sense your character," Susan informed her. Hannah elbowed her, and for the first time all week Neville found himself laughing in class rather than apologizing. After that, herbology became the place where his body remembered ease. He was good with seedlings, good with pruning charms performed close to the stem, good at spotting blight before it spread. He could not always have said how he knew a creeping vine was thirsty rather than diseased, only that the answer seemed to arrive whole the moment he looked properly. Sometimes when Professor Sprout asked a question, the knowledge rose in him before he had time to doubt it. "What's the safest moment to harvest moondew from silver nettle?" Neville's hand lifted without permission. "Just before sunrise, Professor, when the leaves stop trembling." "Exactly right." Hermione turned and looked at him with startled approval. That alone was worth several ecstatic letters home, though he did not quite dare phrase it as such. More unsettling were the moments when the plants themselves seemed to lean toward him. A thorn creeper that had wrapped itself round Dean Thomas's wrist loosened the instant Neville touched the vine and whispered, "Easy," under his breath. A tray of puffapods, notorious for bursting prematurely, held closed while he carried them, and exploded pink blossom the moment he set them down as if they had merely been waiting for permission. Once, while the class was cleaning benches, a dying sprig of dittany near the sink straightened enough to release a fresh, sharp scent when his shadow fell across it. He told no one. There were too many ordinary explanations ready to hand. Luck, gut, attention, temperament, Professor Sprout's greenhouse tricks. Yet each time it happened, the little casket in his trunk felt less like a family oddment and more like a question he was somehow carrying around unopened. At night he dreamed increasingly of roots. Not frightening dreams exactly, more a sensation of descending through cool, dark soil into spaces beneath the castle that were wider than halls and older than stone. In those dreams, he walked among the slow pressure of buried things. Seeds waiting decades for the right season, bulbs storing light in secrecy, roots braided so tightly together they resembled thought. Sometimes there was glass overhead silvered with rain. Sometimes he heard a latch lifting in the distance. He would wake with damp hair and the smell of leaf mold in his nose. The first letter from Augusta that contained praise arrived in late September. Professor Sprout writes that you show uncommon aptitude in herbology. Continue. It is an honorable discipline, though too often neglected by showier minds. Do not let success in one subject excuse carelessness in the rest. Trevor was found asleep in your laundry bag, which suggests you inherited at least some of your grandfather's capacity for concealment. Neville read the letter 3 times. The single word uncommon seemed to glow brighter than the rest. He carried it folded in his pocket all afternoon. Later that day, during double herbology with the Hufflepuffs, Professor Sprout set out a tray of pale green cuttings from a creeping plant with tendrils fine as wire. "Do not let these near exposed skin," she said. "They're only young, but they've ideas above their station." The class bent over the table. One of the cuttings twined immediately around Susan's glove. Another tried to climb Seema's sleeve. Neville reached for the last and felt the tendril brush his wrist before curling. Not tight, but almost companionably around his hand. Professor Sprout saw. For one suspended instant, teacher and student looked at each other through the damp greenhouse light. Neville felt, absurdly, as though he had spoken aloud in a room where he had meant only to think. Then Sprout merely said, "Good handling, Longbottom," and moved on. But she moved more slowly after that, and once, when Neville glanced up from tamping soil around a set of cuttings, he found her watching him with an expression not of suspicion but of old, careful interest. That evening he went back to Gryffindor Tower, mud-stained to the elbow, tired and happier than he understood. When he opened his trunk for clean socks, the casket lay exactly where he had hidden it. Yet the silver rootwork on the lid, in the low amber light from the dormer window, seemed greener than before. Flying was where Grace went to humiliate him. Madame Hooch lined the first years on the lawn one bright, wind-bitten morning and told them to mount their brooms with the bored authority of someone who had watched generations of children either discover aptitude or break themselves trying. Neville stood beside a battered school broom whose handle listed slightly to one side and said, "Up," in a tone that would not have persuaded a spoon. The broom rolled over twice and smacked his ankle. All along the line, brooms leapt obligingly into hands. Harry's came up at once. Hermione's jerked after a delay. Ron sprang neatly upright. Neville tried again, louder. "Up!" This time the broom rose just enough to clip his chin. By the time everyone was mounted, his palms were slick and his throat dry. Heights had never frightened him exactly. Falling had. Falling, in his family, carried too much history. Madame Hooch blew her whistle. "Kick off from the ground hard. Keep your broom steady, rise a few feet and lean forward slightly. On my whistle, back to the ground. 3, 2... Neville was already in the air. His broom, treacherously delighted to find a rider it could disobey, shot upward with catastrophic enthusiasm. The ground dropped away. Wind slapped tears from his eyes. He heard screams, some his own, some from below, and clutched the handle so tightly his knuckles blazed white. Down, he thought wildly. Down, 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 down. The broom chose up. Then his foot slipped. For one hanging instant he was no longer on the broom at all but above it, arms flung wide, the castle turning slowly behind the great sweep of the sky. It was just enough time for a memory not his own to rise. The story of an infant dropped from a window and bouncing alive through rose bushes. And then he hit. Pain burst white through his wrist. When it cleared, he was on the grass with students crowding around and Madame Hooch kneeling over him, her whistle clenched between her teeth like a threat. "Broken," she said curtly after a glance. "Up you get, boy. Let's have you to the hospital wing." Neville sat, dizzy. Something small lay in the grass nearby, round as a marble and shining red with smoke. His Remembrall. Gran had sent it so he should stop losing things. The irony might have amused him if his wrist had not felt as though someone were sawing through it. Draco darted forward and snatched it up before anyone else could move. "Look," he drawled, tossing the glass ball lightly from hand to hand. Longbottom's memory. Madame Hooch rounded on him. "Give that here, Malfoy." Draco backed away, smirking. "I think I'll leave it somewhere for him to find." Neville's face burned. Pain, shame, helplessness. These were familiar enough companions that he knew their order by heart. What he did not know, what arrested him almost more than the throbbing in his wrist, was the sight of Harry stepping forward. "Give it here." There was no hauteur in his voice, no performance. Only an uncomplicated refusal that made Draco's smirk sharpen. "Come and get it, Potter." Madame Hooch had taken Neville only halfway to the castle door when Draco hurled the Remembrall high into the air. A dozen voices shouted. Harry kicked off the ground on his broom as if he had done it in another life, as if gravity had somehow mislaid its claim on him. He rose in a clean, fierce line, robes snapping behind him. Neville forgot his wrist. He watched Harry dive with the astonished hunger one reserves for witnessing a thing one had not dared believe possible. It was not merely skill. It was confidence made visible, the body trusting itself so thoroughly the world had no choice but to answer. Harry caught the Remembrall inches above the earth and skimmed back upward, turning with effortless precision. Even Madame Hook, furious though she was, could not conceal the brief crack of awe across her face. By the time Professor McGonagall marched Harry away for what everyone assumed must be expulsion, Neville was in the hospital wing with his arm being mended by Madame Pomfrey. The bones reconnected with a sensation like hot needles drawn through wax. He hissed and bit his lip. "Hold still," Madame Pomfrey said. "Honestly, first years behave as though falling is compulsory." On the bedside table beside him stood a pot of dittany and a bowl of some sharp-smelling green paste. Neville, still shaky, watched the dittany leaves tremble whenever his newly healed hand moved near them. "You may go when the wooziness passes," Madame Pomfrey said briskly. He might have lingered simply because the white quiet of the ward felt safer than the baffling greatness of the rest of school. But a first year from Hufflepuff was brought in with singed eyebrows, and Madame Pomfrey made it clear by the angle of her shoulders that her sympathy had been exhausted. Neville slipped off the bed, flexed his restored fingers, and reached absently to steady the pot of dittany when he nearly knocked it. At once the plant released a stronger scent, as if bruising itself on purpose to offer help. Neville drew back slowly. All afternoon he turned that moment over in his mind like a pebble in his pocket. By evening, Harry had been made seeker for the Gryffindor Quidditch team instead of expelled, which struck Neville as exactly the sort of incomprehensible injustice that made school feel both marvelous and faintly rigged. Ron thought it glorious. Hermione thought it reckless. Neville thought it perhaps the bravest thing he had ever seen, and the thought sat uneasily beside the memory of his own dangling panic 20 feet in the air. That same night he forgot the password to Gryffindor Tower. It happened because he had gone back for a book. Or perhaps for Trevor. Or perhaps because forgetting seemed to come to him the way weather came to the Highlands, frequently and without personal malice, but with deeply inconvenient results. By the time he returned, panting up the final staircase, the fat lady had retired into her painting and would not so much as open one painted eyelash to his appeals. "Password forgotten means passage forgotten," she told him from behind a painted curtain. "I only stepped away for a minute. And I have only stepped away for a minute every night since 1893. Go to bed outside if you like." So Neville sat on the cold floor with Trevor's basket on his lap and tried not to cry from frustration. That was how Harry, Ron, and Hermione found him slipping out after curfew. "What are you doing?" Hermione hissed. "I forgot the password," Neville whispered back, humiliated. "I couldn't get in." Ron looked stricken with sympathy. Harry looked guilty, though Neville had no idea why. "You can't stay here," Hermione said. "Filch will see you." "I know." "Come on then," Harry muttered, and without further explanation the three of them swept him along through dark corridors that smelled of wax and stone and old draughts. He understood very little of what followed. There was a message about a duel that turned out to be a trick. There was Peeves. There was the frantic slam of doors and the whip of torchlight in distant passages. And then there was the forbidden corridor on the 3rd floor, the one every student had been told to avoid on pain of expulsion. The door, to Neville's everlasting astonishment, was already ajar. They burst through it in a tumble of terror and slammed it shut behind them. A smell met them first, dog dust and something like old meat. Then Harry raised a lamp. The monster filled the room. 3 heads, 3 sets of rolling eyes, 3 muzzles, each large enough to take a child in one bite, reared above a body broader than a carriage. It stood over a trapdoor sunk into the floorboards. 3 noses questing. All 6 eyes bloodshot with offended wakefulness. Neville's legs ceased to belong to him. Ron made a noise like a punctured bagpipe. Hermione clapped both hands over her mouth. Harry stared. The dog lunged. They fled. Only later, sprinting round a corner while their footsteps battered the silence into shards, did Neville register that the fierce warmth in his pocket had begun the moment they entered that room. He skidded to a halt for one perilous second, clutching at his robe. The casket. It was hot against his side. Not merely warm, hot, as if held to a living pulse. "Hurry!" Hermione gasped. Neville ran on. Back in bed an hour later, after explanation and recrimination and the ghastly delayed shaking that follows true fear, he lay staring at the bed curtains and trying to understand why a locked family trinket had burned in his pocket above a trapdoor guarded by a monstrous dog. At last he thought he had it. There had been something under the trapdoor. Something alive. The smell of green things crushed in darkness had reached him only for an instant, buried beneath dog breath and dust. But it had been there. Not leaves. Something older, wilder, coiled. A plant, he thought suddenly. He sat up so fast the mattress ropes creaked. Somewhere beneath the castle, beneath stone and dog and secrets and rules, a plant was growing in the dark. And when he had come near it, whatever slept inside the casket had known. Christmas came to Hogwarts under banners and bewitched snow, but for Neville it came with an owl from Augusta informing him, in a note written more heavily than usual, that he would be home for the holiday and was not to disgrace the station by forgetting either trunk, toad, or self. He returned to Longbottom House in a carriage that smelled of leather and wet wool, carrying a trunk now heavier with books, a mind heavier with questions, and a heart unexpectedly reluctant to leave the castle behind. Home had not changed. That was the first disappointment. The same portraits dozed in the corridors. The same carpets swallowed footsteps. The same silence waited in doorways, full of all the sentences no one in the house ever finished. Yet something had altered in Neville, and because of that the old place felt more watchful than before. At supper, Augusta asked about his marks. He recited them with proper caution. "Acceptable," she said of charms. "A pity," she said of potions, which could have meant the grade or the subject or his existence within it. Then he mentioned herbology. Her knife paused over the roast. Professor Sprout wrote. Neville looked up. "She did? She informs me that you demonstrate uncommon steadiness with living specimens and a notably intuitive hand." Augusta spoke the phrase as though tasting an unfamiliar vintage and finding it not unpleasant. I sent a reply expressing suitable appreciation and advising her not to permit success in one quarter to soften discipline in the rest. "Yes, Gran." After a moment, because he could not help himself, he asked, "What does intuitive hand mean?" Augusta resumed carving. If Pomona Sprout intended plain speaking, she would have used it. Professors rarely do. More potatoes? That was all. Yet Neville went to bed that night carrying those two words around inside him as if they might light a room. 2 days later, Augusta took him to St. Mungo's. Snow had fallen in the night, laying the city under a strange truce. Hooves thudded softly. Chimneys smoked into a pearl-gray sky. Inside the hospital, the radiators hissed and windows blurred with condensation. The permanent spell damage ward glowed with artificial cheerfulness against weather that made every pane look miles away. Alice was in good spirits by the ward's standards, which meant she smiled when Neville entered and immediately began searching her pockets for something to give him. Frank stood by the fireplace this time, one hand on the mantel, staring into flames that reflected in his eyes without entering them. Neville had grown used to the rhythm of these visits, yet Christmas always sharpened them. Festivity elsewhere made stillness here seem crueler. He could not bear the paper snowflakes charmed to drift slowly above the beds. "Mom," he said softly, kneeling before Alice's chair. She patted his face. Then, with great satisfaction, she pressed a peppermint wrapper into his hand. It had been folded into a neat square and smoothed flat, as if she had spent hours making it worthy. "Thank you," Neville whispered. Across the room, Augusta was speaking with a healer about weather, which meant she was not speaking about anything at all. Her posture was immaculate. Only someone who loved her would have noticed how hard she was holding the handle of her handbag. Neville stood and crossed to the window, wrapper tight in his fist. A pot of winter jasmine sat there, trained around a small hoop of wire. It should have been in bloom. Only 3 flowers had opened. He did not touch it. He had learned caution. Yet as he stood there, looking at the pale star petals and the sleeping buds, he felt something inside him lean toward the plant like a body turning to warmth. 2 more buds opened while he watched. He stared, throat gone dry. Behind him, Augusta stopped speaking mid-sentence. The silence that followed was of a different order from the house's ordinary quiet. It was not habit. It... Neville turned slowly. The healer was adjusting a chart, oblivious. Augusta, however, was looking not at him but at the jasmine, her face gone very still. "It is warm in here," she said at last. "Yes," said the healer, though the room was no warmer than it had been 10 seconds before. On the way home, Augusta did not mention the flowers, nor did she mention them at tea, or at supper, or when she found him later that evening standing in the snow at the edge of the old greenhouse yard where the West Glasshouses had once stood. The largest remained intact but shuttered, its panes black with years of neglect and its door webbed shut by winter ivy thick as rope. The others had collapsed long ago into heaps of rusted ribs and broken glass swallowed by nettles. Neville had not meant to come there. He had followed, without quite knowing he followed, a peculiar pull that began the moment he climbed the stairs after supper with the casket in his hand. The thing had grown warm in his pocket again, not fiercely this time, persistently, like a tap at the shoulder. Now he stood before the shuttered greenhouse door while snow sifted down around him and the old ivy leaves shone dark as wet leather. His breath smoked. The casket in his hand seemed almost to hum. The ivy nearest the latch stirred. No wind touched the rest. Neville took one involuntary step back. "What are you doing here?" Augusta's voice did not crack the night. It emerged from it, low and controlled. She stood at the end of the path with a lamp in one hand, her black cloak silvered by snow. Nothing. I only came out to look." "At a locked greenhouse?" He opened his mouth and found no answer that would not sound ridiculous. Augusta came closer, lamp held high. The light struck the casket in his hand. For an instant, the silver rootwork on the lid flashed bright green. Her eyes narrowed. "Give me that." Neville obeyed at once. Yet when she took the casket, her fingers closed on it too fast, as though she feared he might change his mind or it might somehow pull away. She weighed it, frowned at it, and then looked up at the greenhouse. "You are not to come here again without me." His surprise overrode caution. "Why?" "Because I said so." "Yes, but—" "Neville." He stopped. Augusta's gaze softened a fraction, not in indulgence but in weary calculation. "There were glasshouses here once that your great-grandfather kept. He fancied himself a collector of rare species. Some families have dragon habits. Ours preferred greenhouses. Most of it came to nothing." "Me?" The answer felt prepared, which made it less reassuring. "What's in there?" Neville asked. "Dust." She tucked the casket into the crook of her arm. "And a great many things best left sleeping through winter." They went back to the house side by side. Snow whispered down through the bare yews. Behind them, the ivy on the greenhouse door shivered once, like something holding its breath. That night, Augusta came to his room after he had undressed and laid the casket on his bedside table without comment. For a moment, she stood looking at him with an expression he had seen only rarely. Not authority, not disappointment, not even pride, but uncertainty. "When your father was 8, she said abruptly, "he tried to grow moonseed in a teacup because someone told him it would blossom faster if encouraged. It ate the saucer and 3 inches of the tablecloth." Neville blinked. What happened? He was insufferably pleased with himself. The corner of her mouth shifted almost into a smile. "Go to sleep." After she left, Neville lay awake listening to the windscrape branches across the panes. At last he rose, lit the bedside candle, and took from his pocket the peppermint wrapper Alice had given him. It glimmered thin and pink in the flame. He smoothed it carefully. Then, after a hesitation he could not have justified, laid it atop the casket. The silver lines on the lid warmed under the paper. Neville jerked his hand away. The wrapper stayed where it was, trembling once as if from a draught, though the room was still. He blew out the candle and lay back in darkness with his heart thudding. Down the corridor a floorboard creaked under Augusta's measured tread. Far off, beyond the house, the old greenhouse stood under snow, and something within or beneath it seemed very patiently awake. By the time the spring term settled into its long, damp stretch toward Easter, Neville had learned two things with painful clarity. The first was that confidence, once spotted by others, invited almost as much trouble as weakness. The second was that whatever had begun to stir around him was not limited to the tidy and supervised life of greenhouse benches. Professor Sprout's interest remained tactful but unmistakable. She never cornered him with direct questions. Instead, she gave him tasks that required trust, separating flitterbloom runners before they knotted themselves into a choking mass, soothing the roots of young shrivelfigs before transplant, mixing feed for a sullen patch of mooncalves grass that refused to silver properly under enchantment lamps. Neville flourished under responsibility. Plants responded to his patience, and because they responded, he became more patient still. It was a virtuous circle no other subject had yet offered him. One rain-heavy afternoon, a tray of juvenile devil's snare cuttings overturned during class. The accident began with Seamus, as many accidents did, and a chair leg. In the time it took for wood to scrape stone, a dozen dark tendrils spilled over the bench and began moving with terrifying speed toward the nearest warmth. Hannah squealed. Susan backed into a rack of pots. Hermione shouted for fire. Sprout spun round from the far end of the table, already reaching for her wand. Neville did not think. He caught the nearest vine with both bare hands and said, in the same tone he might have used for Trevor halfway to an inconvenient leap, "No." The tendril stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Every eye in the greenhouse turned toward him. Rain drummed on the glass roof. One of the loosened vines had wrapped the leg of Hannah's stool and was squeezing hard enough to crack wood, but the strand in Neville's hands lay suddenly still, dark and slick and listening. Professor Sprout was beside him in 2 strides. With a sharp flick of her wand, she bundled the cuttings back into their tray and set a warming charm over them until their restless twitching subsided. Then she looked at Neville. "Did it scratch you?" "No, Professor." That thoughtful sound again. Hannah, pale under her freckles, whispered, "You touched it." Neville opened and closed his hands. Only for a second. Professor Sprout removed her gloves finger by finger. "Longbottom, stay behind when the others leave." Ron made a face at him on the way out that suggested sympathy for impending doom. Hermione looked positively feverish with curiosity. Harry squeezed Neville's shoulder as he passed, an act of solidarity so small and so instinctive that Neville felt warmed by it for the next 10 minutes. When the greenhouse had emptied, Sprout shut the door and began reordering pots along a shelf. She did not look at Neville while she spoke. "Do you know much about your family's older history?" "Not really, Professor." "Older than your parents, I mean." Neville hesitated. "Only that we're an old family." She brushed soil from her cuffs. "A great many old families are old in very dull ways. Yours was not." He stared. Sprout glanced at him over her spectacles. "Don't look as though I've announced there's a basilisk in the potting shed." "I said was, not is. The wizarding world forgets what does not dazzle it. Herb lore warding, the old Glasshouse lines, root binding. Most of it pushed aside as wandcraft grew showier, and wars made subtler skills seem less important, until suddenly everyone needs antidotes and sanctuaries again, and wonders where the people who knew such things have gone." I know thee. Neville had the odd feeling that the warm floor of the greenhouse had shifted under him by half an inch. "What has that got to do with me?" Sprout studied him for a long moment. "At present? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps a great deal. Either way, if any plant behaves strangely around you, You will tell me. Menai. He swallowed. Yes, Professor. And if anyone says foolish things about blood and old names because they've noticed you're good with roots, you may ignore them. Gifts are not virtues. They are only tools until character decides what to do with them. The words landed more heavily than she could have known, because Draco Malfoy had already begun, in small polished doses, to reshape Neville's aptitude into an insult. Longbottom's found his level, Draco said one afternoon outside the greenhouses, as a cluster of Slytherins laughed. Perhaps they'll let him pot geraniums for the ministry one day. Old families do like a specialty. It would have hurt less if the tone had been openly mocking. Instead, there was something slyly congratulatory in it, as if Neville ought to be flattered that his bloodline had at last manifested in a socially recognizable direction. Neville muttered something incoherent and kept walking. Harry, who had heard, stopped in the path. Ignore him. I am, Neville lied. But Draco's words clung. He had spent enough of his life being inadequate within the expectations of an old family to resent bitterly the notion that some buried inheritance might now be expected to redeem him. He did not want anything that would make people like Draco nod as if the world had snapped back into its proper shape. And yet at the same time, in the private bruised chambers of his heart, some hungry part of him thrilled to the idea that there might be one thing. Just one. That he had not borrowed from anyone. The punishment detention in the Forbidden Forest came at the end of a week so exhausting he nearly accepted it as an act of mercy. Norbert the Dragon, though he would not think of him by name while awake if he could help it, had been smuggled out of Hogwarts in a haze of whispered planning and catastrophic luck. Neville, who had not been part of the plot but had stumbled through its edges often enough to feel complicit, found himself caught after curfew and sentenced alongside Harry, Hermione, and Draco. Ron was laid low in the hospital wing. That felt to Neville exactly like the sort of arbitrary sorting of suffering at which the universe excelled. Hagrid met them at the forest edge with Fang and a lantern. The Forbidden Forest at night was not darkness but layers of it. Tree trunks rose like pillars from black loam. Branches braided overhead so densely that moonlight descended only in torn fragments. The smell was of moss, water, old leaves, and beneath all that something metallic and wrong. Unicorn's been hurt, Hagrid said, voice lowered despite himself. We're to find out what done it. They set off between the trees. Neville's shoes sank softly into needles. Draco muttered complaints at his shoulder. Somewhere ahead the lantern swung, spilling gold on roots like knuckled hands. The wrongness in the air deepened. It was not simply fear. Neville knew fear. This was more intimate and less dramatic, like the sense of rot hidden inside a fruit whose skin remained unblemished. Ferns lay flattened in a direction no natural passage accounted for. A patch of foxglove near a fallen log had blackened at the tips as if frost had touched it in midsummer. Even the damp seemed wounded. He slowed without meaning to. What's the matter? Draco hissed. Neville looked down. A spray of wood sorrel at the base of an oak had curled its leaves tight, every small heart-shaped leaflet furled inward. It was an ordinary plant, common as rain, yet the distress in its posture struck him with such force he nearly crouched beside it. Nothing, he said, but his voice came out thin. Then they found the unicorn blood. It lay silver on the dead leaves, luminous and terrible. The sight of it pierced Neville more sharply than any corpse ought to have done. Perhaps because the blood looked alive even as it stained. Perhaps because everything growing near it recoiled. Moss gone gray, fern fronds crisped, fungus peeling from bark in dry white tongues. Hagrid sent Harry and Draco one way with Fang, Hermione and himself another. Neville, by a luck no better than before, was paired with Draco after all. They moved through the trees with Fang blundering ahead, and both boys trying not to betray how badly they wanted the other to speak first. A branch cracked somewhere to their left. Draco flinched. What was that? Neville had no answer. The forest had begun to feel aware of them, not hostile exactly, but alert in the way of living things that sense infection. Then he saw it, another streak of silver on the ground ahead, and beyond it a shape bent over something pale. The creature wore a hood. It drank. Fang yelped and bolted. Draco made a sound Neville would later remember with more tenderness than mockery, because it was pure terror stripped of social varnish. Neville could not move. The hooded head lifted. Whatever lay beneath the cowl had no business inhabiting the earth. Every plant around them seemed to shrink. Then, with a rush of hooves and cold light, something burst through the trees between them and the thing by the blood. The hooded figure fled. A centaur reared, pale hair streaming like water in the moonlight. Firenze. The name came later. In that first instant, Neville knew only the impossible beauty and grave utterness of the being before him. "Are you hurt?" the centaur asked Harry somewhere behind. Neville had not even realized Harry had come near. Then those dark, strange eyes shifted briefly to Neville. It was a glance, nothing more. Yet Neville felt seen through in a way that did not expose embarrassment or smallness, only some buried green thread in him he had barely begun to suspect. Firenze's nostrils flared. "The forest remembers old bargains," he said. Though whether to Hagrid to the trees, or to no one Neville could not tell. Later, safe enough to breathe again and stumbling back toward the castle with his legs like wire, Neville looked down as they crossed a patch of bracken. The ferns nearest his boots were bent, not broken, bent, forming, without any natural reason, a narrow lane that led away from the silver blood and back toward the path. He followed it without speaking. Behind him, the forest closed. Exams approached with the pitiless inevitability of weather, and whatever romance Hogwarts possessed for those fortunate enough to be naturally gifted narrowed for Neville into a daily question of whether he could keep from disappointing everyone at once. Stress made forgetting worse. Forgetting made stress worse. The cycle fed on itself until he felt by June like a badly tied parcel of nerves being bounced from lesson to lesson. It did not help that the closer the year crept toward its end, the stranger the castle seemed to become. There were more whispered conferences between Harry, Ron, and Hermione. More glances toward the forbidden corridor. More evidence that they knew something serious and were deciding, in that infuriating heroic way of theirs, whether to meddle with it. Neville observed these things with growing concern and no clear means of intervention. He was fond of them, which meant he was often angry with them. Friendship, he was beginning to discover, had not improved with magical education upon ordinary human tendency toward idiocy. Potions remained its own dungeon-bound hell. On the morning of their practical review, Snape set before each student a tray of ingredients and instructions for a stabilizing solution, requiring exact timing, delicate heat, and the bruising of a cluster of marsh herbs whose scent alone made Neville's stomach tight. The herbs were fresh, vivid green, and should have released an aromatic sweetness when crushed. In his hands they blackened at the edges. "No, Longbottom," Snape said softly from behind his shoulder, which was somehow worse than being shouted at. "One might almost think you were trying to murder the plant before the potion." Neville swallowed. "Sorry, sir. An apology from you has all the practical utility of a rain dance in the Lake District." A few Slytherins laughed. Neville's ears burned. He adjusted the flame too high. The potion foamed. He snatched the cauldron away and nearly knocked over the sliced root beside it. Hermione, 2 places down, made frantic invisible gestures with her spoon. Snape's sleeve brushed Neville's arm as he reached to lower the heat with a flick of his wand. "You have a singular ability, Longbottom, to approach mediocrity from below." There were moments when shame became so familiar it almost numbed. This was not one of them. This was the bright raw kind that made the skin feel too tight. Yet, as Neville stared down at the pot and the ruined herbs, something else stirred under the humiliation. A kind of wrongness, subtler than panic. He knew these plants. Not these exact sprigs, perhaps, but their nature, their needs. He could feel, absurdly, that Snape had harvested them too early. They wanted more shade before cutting. More water after. Bruised under the wrong moon, even. The knowledge flashed through him, swift as lightning, and seemed no more useful than lightning in a cellar. He reached into his pocket by instinct and felt the casket there, warm, When the lesson ended with his potion barely passable and his dignity in tatters, Hermione cornered him outside the dungeon. "You had the flame too high, but before that you were bruising the marsh ward backward," she said in a rush. "Honestly, Neville, if you'd only read the chapter again." "I did read it." She stopped. "Oh, it's not that I didn't know the steps." He stared past her at the torchlit stone. "It's that the herbs were wrong." Hermione opened her mouth with all the force of reason marshaled at her command. Then she closed it again, perhaps because she knew him well enough by now to recognize the difference between ignorance and conviction. "What do you mean, wrong?" Neville rubbed his thumb over the casket through his pocket lining. "I don't know." She frowned, not dismissive but intensely dissatisfied. "That is an appalling answer." "I know." After a moment, her expression softened by a degree so small most people would have missed it. "You're good in herbology, better than any of us. Professor Sprout says so. Maybe potions just isn't similar enough. It ought to have been comfort." Instead, Neville heard in it the same division he was trying to understand inside himself. In the greenhouse, knowledge came like rain entering thirsty soil. In Snape's dungeon, everything withered at the moment of contact. Why should one kind of plant open toward him while another shrank in his grip? Why did roots and vines seem to answer his patience, while cut, measured ingredients laid out for use in formal spellwork went dead and stubborn? Because one is living and the other is not, some quiet part of him suggested. The idea stayed. Their herbology examination 2 days later confirmed it. Professor Sprout set out stations through 3 separate greenhouses, each with a different task. Identify blight in a tray of moonseed seedlings. Prune a biting creeper without being bitten. Repot a pair of sleeping bulb roots and note signs of distress. Most students performed adequately. Hermione performed brilliantly while annoyed that excellence could not be properly footnoted. Neville moved through the tasks with an ease so complete it felt to him almost like joy. At the final station, Sprout had placed an ailing wych elm sapling in a cracked ceramic pot. Its leaves were bronze at the tips, its bark split. A card beside it asked for diagnosis and treatment. Neville looked once and knew. "Root-bound," he said aloud before remembering it was an exam. "And lonely." Sprout, who had been noting marks nearby, looked up sharply. "Lonely?" He flushed. "I mean, it's been kept by itself too long. Wych elms don't like that. They grow better near older wood." There was a small silence. Then Sprout said, very quietly, "Go on." He repotted the sapling into a wider container, mixed feed with more iron than the standard measure, and set it beside a mature boxwood. By the time he finished tightening the soil, one of the drooping leaves had lifted. Sprout made a note on her parchment and did not speak until the bell rang. Then, as the others filed out under the clamor of end-of-year nerves, she laid a firm earth-stained hand for a moment on Neville's shoulder. "Longbottom," she said, "do not let anyone frighten you out of paying attention to what you can plainly see." He could think of nothing to say. She moved away before he found words. That night he dreamed not of roots but of glass. He stood in a greenhouse larger than any he had seen, a cathedral of panes silvered by rain. Vines climbed iron ribs overhead in patient spirals. Beds of dark soil ran away into half-light. At the far end, where moonlight pooled on flagstones, someone waited beside a stone table. Neville could not see the figure's face. Only the outline of a hand laid flat on the table, and on the table itself a carved casket very like his own, except that its lid stood open, and within it lay a single green seed glowing like a star underwater. The figure said something. Neville woke before the words arrived. His pillow was damp. The room smelled unmistakably of crushed mint. He sat up and groped for the trunk. Inside, under socks and letters, and a book on 1,000 magical herbs and fungi, the casket thrummed once against his palm, and then went still. He almost woke Dean to ask whether there was mint in the room. But Dean would only have said no, and then Neville would have had to explain why his own belongings seemed to behave like secrets in a fairy tale. Instead, he put the casket under his pillow and lay awake till dawn listening to the tower breathe. At breakfast, Harry barely touched his toast. Ron looked as though he had swallowed a live snidget. Hermione's mouth was set in the dangerous way it did when she had decided something and resented the necessity of doing it. Neville watched them across the table and felt dread gather with a certainty stronger than knowledge. Something was going to happen. Something more than exams, more than house points, more than ordinary school disasters. The castle seemed to know it too. Through the open windows, warm June air drifted in carrying the smell of cut grass and greenhouse damp, and beneath that, very faintly, the same bruised wrongness he had sensed in the forest near Silver Blood. He looked down at his plate. The casket was warm again. The night Harry, Ron, and Hermione tried to leave the common room under the invisibility cloak, Neville was waiting for them. He had not intended to become a sentry. He had only meant to stay awake until he was sure the restless unease in the tower had settled into nothing worse than overtaxed imagination. But the common room fire had burned low and deep, throwing the red hangings into shadow and painting the room with the sort of half-light in which courage and foolishness resemble one another too closely. Neville sat in an armchair with Trevor in his lap and the casket heavy in his dressing gown pocket, listening. After midnight came the creak of floorboards overhead. He stood before he had fully decided to do so. At first he saw no one. Then a shimmer moved near the boys' staircase, a distortion in the air no brighter than breath on glass. Neville's heart thudded. He knew at once what it must be. Harry's father's cloak. Ron had whispered about it often enough, thinking Neville asleep. He moved to the portrait hole and planted himself in front of it. A moment later, Harry's head appeared. The cloak slipped back just enough to reveal his face. Ron and Hermione stood close behind, pale in the firelight. "Neville," Harry said in a fierce whisper. "Move." "No." Ron looked torn between exasperation and admiration. Hermione closed her eyes for a brief second as if petitioning higher powers for patience. "You can't go out," Neville said. His voice shook. He hated that it shook. "You've already lost Gryffindor loads of points. If you're caught again, we'll all be in trouble." Harry glanced toward the staircase. "We have to." "To do what?" There was a beat of silence too long to be accidental. Neville looked from one face to another and, for perhaps the first time in his life, allowed himself the ugly possibility that the people he liked might decide he was not worth the truth. It hurt more than he expected. "Something stupid," he said before any of them could speak. "Something dangerous and stupid. That's what you always do." Hermione's expression changed. For one brief, startling instant, she looked ashamed. "Neville," she said. "Softer now. Please. We don't have time to explain." Then you don't have time to go." He did not know where the words came from. They seemed to rise from the same buried stubbornness the Sorting Hat had recognized long before he had. Fear coursed through him so hard his knees felt watery. Harry had faced a troll. Ron played wizard chess like a tactician. Hermione could remember half the library and use the other half as a weapon. Neville was simply Neville, forgetful, clumsy, permanently half a beat behind the world. Yet here he stood because the thought of them going out into danger while he stepped aside felt, suddenly, impossible. I'll fight you," he said, and heard how absurd it sounded. Ron made a strangled noise. Harry said, almost pleading, "Neville, get out of the way." "No." For a second, nobody moved. The fire cracked. Trevor blinked solemnly from the armchair cushion where Neville had set him down. Somewhere in the dormitory above, someone snored. Then Hermione raised her wand. "I'm sorry." The spell hit him before he could flinch. It was a peculiar sensation, full body bind, like becoming one's own statue. Neville toppled sideways, rigid, and hit the hearthrug with all the grace of dropped furniture. He could still see. He could still hear. He could not do a thing about either. Harry's face came into view above him, stricken and determined. "We'll explain later." Then the cloak dropped and they were gone. The portrait closed. Neville lay staring at the underside of a table while fury, humiliation, betrayal, and a ghastly, helpless love all tried to occupy the same body at once. He wanted to shout. He wanted to cry. He wanted absurdly to be brave enough that next time they would not think an explanation wasted on him. The casket in his pocket burned. He could not reach it. He could only feel the heat spreading through the fabric of his dressing gown, pooling against his side. Minutes passed, or hours. Petrification made time viscous. The embers in the grate collapsed softly inward. A draft moved across the floor. The tapestry hanging nearest the portrait hole stirred. There was no open window. No one had come through. Yet a loose strand from the embroidered border, merely thread, surely only thread, brushed his hand where it lay rigid against the carpet. For one wild moment Neville thought the cloth had bent down to touch him like a vine-seeking sun. Then the fire sank lower, and the common room darkened, and he no longer trusted anything he saw. He was eventually found by some late-returning prefect and released with much confusion. By then, dawn was paling the windows. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had not yet reappeared. Neville went to bed fully dressed and slept for perhaps an hour, after which the entire castle seemed to erupt into rumor, emergency, and then, more astonishingly than all the rest, relief. It turned out that everything had happened. Not all of it became public, of course. Even by Hogwarts standards, there were limits to what one could announce over breakfast. But by evening, enough had filtered down through portraits, prefects, and the ghastly accuracy of student gossip that Neville understood the broad shape. A hidden stone, a trap, Professor Quirrell unmasked, Harry hurt but alive, the school safe. He sat through the end-of-year feast, dazed. The great hall had been dressed in Slytherin green and silver. Banners hung from the walls. The air hummed with expectation. Slytherin table looked smug enough to sink from its own self-satisfaction. Neville, exhausted and cross and still privately wounded by the previous night, picked at his food and prepared to clap politely when required. Then, Albus Dumbledore rose. There were, Neville realized, men who controlled a room by force, and men who controlled it by delight. Dumbledore did the latter so thoroughly that the hall leaned toward him before he spoke. His beard shimmered in the candlelight. His eyes, behind half-moon spectacles, were not at all the eyes of a man who missed much. "There are all kinds of courage," he said after the first round of points and gasps and cheers. "It takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies, but just as much to stand up to our friends." Neville's fork slipped from his fingers. "I therefore award 10 points to Mr. Neville Longbottom." For a fraction of a second, the hall went perfectly still. Neville heard the words as if from underwater. Then Gryffindor exploded. The noise was physical. Fred and George Weasley pounded the table as though trying to break it. Someone seized Neville around the shoulders hard enough to jolt him. Harry, white-faced but grinning from the staff table's direction as Madame Pomfrey shepherded him back to his seat, raised his goblet. Ron shouted himself hoarse. Hermione's eyes shone with something fiercer and warmer than apology. 10 points. For him. Not because he had accidentally survived something. Not because he had inherited a name. Not because a plant had answered or a teacher had taken interest. Because he had chosen, while frightened and outmatched and entirely unsure of himself, to stand where he thought he should stand and hold the line. The house cup changed hands in a roar of scarlet and gold. Neville could scarcely breathe. Later, when the hall had emptied and the banners overhead had transformed into Gryffindor colors, Harry found him by the doorway. Neville. Neville looked at him. Harry still seemed slightly unreal, as people do after surviving events too large for their own age. "You were right to try and stop us," Harry said. Anger, which had frayed into pain and then into reluctant admiration over the course of the day, gave one last tired flick. "You still went." Harry smiled a little. Yeah. But you were right." "Nay. Unter." There were many things Neville might have said. That being right had not made him feel less foolish on the carpet. That he did not know whether to forgive Hermione's spell or thank her for later weeping over it. That courage and resentment sat awkwardly in the same chest. Instead, he heard himself ask, Did you really face you-know-who? Harry's expression altered, shadows moving behind the green of his eyes. Sort of. Neville thought of the forest, of silver blood on leaves, of plants recoiling from an unseen rot. He put a hand over the casket in his pocket. It had gone cool at last. "Glad you're back," he said. Harry's answering look held a brief, startled gratitude, as if he had not expected the simple sentence to matter. "Glad you are too." That night, for the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, Neville slept without dreaming of locked glass or hidden roots. But when he woke at dawn and opened his trunk to begin packing for home, he found the casket lying open by a crack, no wider than a fingernail. Inside, for the brief second before he blinked, something green gleamed. Then the lid settled shut again. The journey home after winning the House Cup ought to have felt triumphant. For Neville, it felt unreal. Students crowded the compartments with stories already hardening into legend. Harry slept for half the ride, exhaustion carving him quiet. Ron relived each second of the year's disasters with improved dialogue. Hermione attempted to correct him until she gave up and laughed instead. Trevor was discovered, for once helpfully, under Neville's seat before departure, and snored through the entire trip with his throat pulsing like a tiny old engine. Neville held the casket in his lap when no one was looking. It had not reopened. Yet, the silver line at the clasp seemed brighter than ever, and whenever the train passed a stretch of countryside thick with hedgerows or summer meadows, the wood beneath his fingers gave a faint answering warmth, as though recognizing kinship in every green mile. Augusta was waiting on the platform at King's Cross in black silk and the familiar vulture-topped hat, upright amidst the steam like an old standard planted before battle. Neville braced himself for formal acknowledgement, perhaps a brief approval wrapped in criticism as gifts were wrapped at Longbottom House, carefully and with strings tight enough to discourage immediate enjoyment. Instead, after he had stumbled through the barrier with trunk and toad and she had looked him over from head to heel to verify the survival of all essential parts, she said, "I received word from Professor McGonagall, and from Pomona Sprout, and most unusually, from the headmaster." Neville swallowed. "Oh, you won 10 points for standing up to your friends." "Yes, Gran." A long moment passed. The station noise seemed to recede around them. Then Augusta nodded once, sharply, as if ratifying something in herself rather than in him. "Good." One word. Yet it landed with such force that Neville had to look away. They traveled home in a silence less oppressive than usual. Rain had washed London clean. The evening over Upper Flagley was long and gold when the carriage turned into the lane between the yews. Longbottom House rose from its trees, with windows afire in sunset, ancient and self-contained, as though it had merely paused all year and waited for him to return different. He was barely through supper when Augusta sent word that he was to come to the study. Not Frank's old study. That room remained largely untouched. This was the smaller room overlooking the south lawn where she conducted estate business and correspondence. The lamp was already lit when he entered. On the desk lay 3 things: his father's wand, the casket, and a folded letter bound in green ribbon with the school seal broken. Augusta did not ask him to sit. She stood at the window, gloved hands clasped behind her back. "Professor Sprout's second letter was more detailed than the first," she said. "She wrote again after term ended. She is a prudent woman. I take prudent women seriously, especially when they choose to alarm me." Neville's mouth went dry. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know." She turned. "That is not the same as saying nothing has happened." The room seemed suddenly very small. "I want you to tell me," Augusta said. "And I want you to tell me precisely. No modest omissions. No nervous nonsense. Every odd thing you can recall involving plants, that casket, or the West greenhouse." There was something in her face. Fear, yes, but not fear of him. Fear for him, perhaps. It made honesty easier than he had expected. So he told her. He told her about the starflowers at St. Mungo's and the hellebore bud in the garden. about the seedling trays and the devil's snare cutting and the forest bracken bending away from silver blood, about the warmth of the casket near the trapdoor and the crack that had appeared after Dumbledore awarded points. He even told her about the dream greenhouse and the mint smell in the night, though he did so apologetically. Augusta listened without interrupting. Only once did she close her eyes, and that was when he described the jasmine opening on the hospital sill. When he had finished, she took off her gloves one finger at a time and laid them on the desk. "I had hoped," she said at last, "that the old stories were stories." Neville stared. "What stories?" She looked at the casket for so long he wondered whether she had heard him. Then she said, very quietly, "There were lines among the old families, before blood politics turned every conversation into idiocy, who kept narrow inheritances. Not greater magic. Narrower. A talent that ran in some branches and vanished in others. Your grandfather called it folklore, and your father had no patience for pedigree myths, except where dark wizards were concerned, which was the only respect in which he was entirely right. The Longbottoms," her gaze shifted to him. "The Longbottoms were once known for living wards." Neville barely breathed. "What does that mean?" "It means they grew protection instead of only casting it. It means certain houses sent for them when cursed ground had to be cleansed or sacred places kept from decay. It means there were greenhouses here once that held plants no longer common in Britain because the family cultivated them not for vanity but for craft." Her mouth thinned. "It also means several tedious cousins spent 2 centuries using the word blood as though it were a moral argument, and by the time that nonsense had finished poisoning the subject, most sensible people preferred to forget the inheritance entirely." He looked from her to the casket and back again. "You think that's me?" "I think something that belonged to a much older Longbottom woman has chosen to wake in your hands. I think Pomona sprouts suspects enough to be frightened and polite at once. And I think," for the first time her composure frayed, revealing astonishment beneath, "that if this had come through any boy but you, I might distrust it more." A strange hot pressure rose behind Neville's eyes. "Why?" "Because power attached to vanity becomes vulgar very quickly." Augusta stepped forward. "Yours has so far attached itself to kindness and a refusal to move when you believe movement would be wrong. That is more promising." No one had ever spoken of him in quite that way. He did not know where to put the feeling. The casket clicked. Both of them looked down. A thin seam of green light shone between lid and base. Neville reached for it before he thought better. The wood was warm, almost living. As his fingertips touched the silver clasp, a sharp edge hidden in the metal nicked his thumb. One bright bead of blood welled and fell onto the carved root at the center of the lid. The casket opened. Not dramatically. No flare of power. No burst of wind. The clasp simply released with the soft inevitability of a bud dividing at dawn. Inside lay a bed of black earth, rich and damp as if freshly turned. In the earth rested a single seed the size of a thumbnail, green shot with silver, and beneath it a folded strip of parchment sealed in wax so old it had gone nearly white. For a moment neither spoke. Augusta was the first to move. She touched the parchment seal, inhaled sharply, and drew back. "Araminta's mother indeed," she murmured. "This predates her by at least 3 generations." Neville stared at the seed. It was not inert. He would have sworn, though reason recoiled, that it pulsed with the quiet patience of a sleeping heart. "Can I touch it?" Augusta met his eyes. Something like resolve entered her face. "Come with me." She took up a lamp. Neville snatched his father's wand from the desk without knowing why and followed. They went not through the main corridors but by the back stair, down past storage rooms, and the old still room where herbs had once hung to dry in dusky bunches, out through a side door into the summer night. Crickets sang in the high grass. Moonlight silvered the yew hedges. Longbottom House loomed behind them, full of dark windows and sleeping portraits. Ahead, the shuttered greenhouse waited. Augusta did not hesitate. She laid her wand against the heavy lock on the outer gate and said, "Aperio." Rust gave with a scream. Ivy dropped from the latch in thick ropes. The air beyond smelled of wet stone and buried summer. "The door itself won't open to my spells," she said. "It never has." Neville shifted the casket to one hand and stepped toward the glasshouse. Up close, the old panes were not entirely dark. Moonlight seeped through grime and dead vine. He could see shapes within: broken benches, hanging chains, the ghostly ribs of shelving. The moment he reached for the handle, the seed inside the casket flared green. The door swung inward. Heat breathed out to meet them. Not summer heat. Greenhouse heat. Damp, living, fragrant. Augusta's lamp flame shivered. Neville crossed the threshold and stopped dead. The interior had not been dead at all, only sleeping. Beds that had seemed choked with black ruin from outside now revealed ranks of stems just beneath the surface, swelling. Vines trailed from the rafters, gray one second, silver-green the next as color ran into them like ink in water. Moss brightened along the flagstones. At the far wall, a trellis of what looked like dry thorn erupted leaf by leaf under his gaze. Augusta made a sound Neville had never heard from her. Not fear, not command. Wonder. The casket in his hand grew too warm to hold. He set it on an old potting table. The seed lifted by itself a fraction from the earth and settled again. Every plant in the glasshouse seemed to lean toward him. Neville's breath came shallow. He could feel them, not with ears or eyes exactly, but with something beneath thought. Thirst. Death. Relief. Age diet. Dormancy stretching into waking. A tray of shrunken bulbs near the wall rang in his mind like tiny bells of need. The thorn vine overhead hummed with pleased recognition. Deep under the floor, roots he could not see shifted against one another and sent up a pulse so vast and slow it seemed older than memory. "What I do?" he whispered. Augusta, standing beside him with the lamp lowered and tears standing unshed in her eyes, said the most astonishing thing she had ever said to him. "I don't know." He turned back to the table. Beside the casket lay the strip of parchment, the wax seal now cracked cleanly through. Neville picked it up with hands that were no longer shaking from fear but from intensity. The writing within was faded brown, slanted and precise. "To the child in whom the old bond wakes," it began, "if bond it proves to be." The rest blurred and vanished before he could read further, the ink sinking into the page as if it had remembered its own secrecy. Neville stared. It disappeared. "It is warded," Augusta said hoarsely. "Or waiting." A brittle stem in the nearest bed split. From within emerged a shoot pale as moon milk, unfurling with impossible speed. Neville crouched without thinking and laid his cut thumb against the soil. Warmth poured up his arm. The shoot turned green where he touched it. Leaves opened, veined silver. Along the side wall, a line of sleeping vines awakened in answer, racing over cracked glass in patterns like writing. He heard, from somewhere very near and very far, the whisper of a woman's voice. Not words. "Welcome." Neville jerked upright. "Did you hear that?" Augusta's face had gone white beneath the lamplight. "Hear what?" He looked around. On the far wall, half concealed by ivy and shadow, hung a row of old portraits he had never seen before, smoke darkened by age. One of them showed a witch in severe robes with a gardener's knife at her belt and a coil of green vine embroidered at the hem. Her painted mouth was closed. Her painted eyes, however, seemed brighter than paint should manage. The seed on the table cracked. A root no thicker than thread pushed into the black earth, then another. The smell of living things deepened, mint and rosemary and rain on loam, blossom and sap, and the dark, clean scent of turned ground after storm. Neville gripped Frank's wand in one hand and the edge of the potting bench in the other and realized, with a clarity so profound it banished every lesser fear for one incandescent instant, that he was not standing in the ruins of some forgotten family hub. He was standing in the threshold of an inheritance that had slept beneath dust, grief, ridicule, and war, until it found a child gentle enough to listen and stubborn enough to remain. Below the flagstones, the roots moved again, vast and interlaced. This time, when they answered him, he understood that they were not waking for the night. They were waking for him.